We often think about cyber attacks as something hitting our computers, right, or our phones, these kind of virtual spaces. But what happens when those attacks sort of jump off the screen and start messing with the real world?
Right.
Like targeting things like our water supply.
Yeah, that's the really unsettling side of our kind of interconnected world, right? Where these digital threats can actually have real physical consequences. And we're not just talking about, a scary movie plot here. This is actually happening.
Exactly. And it's been happening for a while.
Right.
Let's take you back to the year 2000 in Maroochy, Australia.
Okay.
A disgruntled insider managed to hack into the sewage control system.
Wow.
Now, sewage might not sound like the most glamorous target, but
Yeah.
the impact was huge. They released 150 million liters of raw wastewater.
Oh, wow.
The cleanup cost a hefty $200,000, and that, incredibly, was one of the early signs of this kind of threat.
It was, and what's really concerning is that these kinds of attacks are becoming more and more frequent. In just the last 2 decades, we've seen over 15 significant incidents that have targeted water systems.
Really?
Yeah, and that puts the water industry among the top 4 most targeted sectors globally.
15 major attacks in 20 years. That's more than one every other year.
It is.
And, for you listening, think about what that actually means. If we're talking about potentially huge financial burdens, but more importantly, really serious problems for communities if their access to clean water is disrupted.
Precisely, when we're talking about essential services like water, the repercussions go way beyond just, dollars and cents. It affects public health and safety, the basic well-being of everyone.
It's a really big deal, and that's what we're diving deep into today.
Absolutely.
We've been looking at some fascinating research that's really tackling this challenge head on, focusing on a really innovative way to protect water distribution systems from these kinds of attacks.
Yeah, and at the heart of our discussion is this really compelling paper. It's titled A Time Series Self-Supervised Learning Approach to Detection of Cyber-Physical Attacks in Water Distribution Systems by Mahmoud Wu and Gaber.
Okay, so let's unpack that title a bit because it sounds a little technical, I'll admit, but the ideas inside are really key to understanding how we're building better defenses against these real-world cyber threats.
Yeah.
Our mission today is to really understand this novel 2-stage system they're proposing for spotting these cyber-physical attacks in water systems.
What's particularly interesting about this approach is their use of both self-supervised and unsupervised machine learning. And the goal here is to really strike that crucial balance, detecting these attacks with high accuracy, but also doing it in near real time.
Right. So in the simplest terms, what are they suggesting?
Sure.
What does this 2-stage system actually look like?
So the paper introduces this really clever 2-part approach. The first stage uses something called self-supervised learning. Think of it as a really quick initial scan to flag anything that looks suspicious. Then the second stage kicks in, and this uses unsupervised learning to take a closer look and confirm whether it's a real attack or not.
So it's like a preliminary alarm that goes off if something seems out of place, followed by a more, in-depth investigation to see if it's a genuine threat. And the researchers are suggesting this to get around some of the weaknesses of older security methods, but also because we don't really have a huge history book of past attacks on water systems to learn from, right?
Exactly. The lack of a large data set of labeled past cyber-physical attacks is a significant obstacle, and this 2-stage approach really aims to overcome that challenge.
Okay, so let's sort of dig a little deeper into why water systems are becoming such a prime target in the first place. We keep hearing about these modern water distribution systems. What makes them so vulnerable to these kinds of attacks?
The main reason is the increasing blend of digital and physical components. Historically, keeping water systems safe was mostly about physical security, right fences, locks protocols. But now, with the introduction of digital control systems, sensors everywhere, interconnected networks, the potential points of attack have multiplied dramatically.
Okay, so it's not just about someone physically breaking into a water treatment plant anymore.
Not at all. These modern systems rely heavily on what are called SCADA systems, that's supervisory control and data acquisition, and PLCs, or programmable logic controllers. These are essentially the brains and the muscles of the operation. They control everything from how much water is flowing at what pressure, the purification processes themselves, and these digital components can be targeted by cyber attacks.
So to really understand the threat here, what kind of attacks are we talking about in this cyber-physical world of water distribution?
The research paper highlights a few common examples. One is directly messing with the physical systems. Imagine hackers taking control of the sensors that measure water levels or actuators that control pumps and valves. They could, for instance, make a sensor report a false water level, which then tells the system to turn pumps on or off in a way that causes a flood or a shortage.
That's a really unsettling thought.
Yeah.
Fake information leading to real-world water problems.
It is another type of attack involves disrupting the communication between these physical systems. If an attacker can intercept or change the signals being sent between sensors controllers, the main SCADA system, they can create all sorts of problems.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there are direct attacks on the SCADA system itself, like what happened in Marucci Shire.
Right.
Getting unauthorized access to that central control hub allows attackers to directly manipulate the entire water infrastructure.
So it's like opening a digital doorway right into our physical water supply
Right.
for anyone with the wrong intentions.
Right.
Now we already have some security measures in place.
Yeah.
Right? Like encrypting data, making sure only authorized people can access the systems. So why aren't those enough to protect us from these kind of sophisticated cyber-physical threats?
That's a really important question. Traditional security measures like encrypting data using passwords are still vital layers of defense, but they mostly work on the assumption that the attackers are outside the system trying to get in.
Okay.
The challenge with these advanced cyber-physical attacks is that attackers who really understand how the water system works, they might be able to bypass these outer defenses.
So they might already be inside digitally speaking, or they know enough about the system to kind of make their malicious actions look like normal activity.
Precisely, if an attacker knows the typical patterns of how the system behaves, the relationships between different parts, they can craft attacks that don't trigger traditional alarms.
Oh.
Think about slowly changing the setting of a valve over time. It might not look like a sudden break-in, but could still have significant consequences for water pressure and flow.
Oh, I see.
Also, as we discussed, the lack of a big history of past cyber-physical attacks means it's hard to train traditional security systems to recognize known attack patterns.
That makes sense. You can't really defend against something you haven't seen before, especially if it's designed to blend in with normal operations.
Right.
So this brings us to how machine learning can help. How can these smart algorithms do a better job of spotting these kinds of attacks?
Machine learning offers a really powerful set of tools because it can learn these complex patterns from data without needing explicit step-by-step programming.
Okay.
The paper touches on the four main types: supervised, semi-supervised, self-supervised, and unsupervised learning.
Okay, so let's break those down a bit, because you've probably heard of supervised and unsupervised learning before. What makes the self and semi versions different? And why are self-supervised and unsupervised learning seen as particularly useful for protecting these water systems?
So supervised learning, at its core, learns from labeled examples. You feed the algorithm data that's already tagged as either normal or attack, and it learns to tell the difference. Unsupervised learning, on the other hand, works with data that isn't labeled. It's trying to find natural groupings, unusual data points, without prior knowledge of what an attack looks like.
Right.
Semi-supervised learning kind of sits in between. It uses a little bit of labeled data along with a lot of unlabeled data.
Right.
And then self-supervised learning.
Yeah, this one sounds like it's teaching itself.
That's a great way to think about it.
Yeah.
Self-supervised learning actually generates its own training examples from the normal workings of the system itself without needing someone to manually label the data.
Wow.
And this is really valuable for protecting water systems because, as we've said, we just don't have this huge amount of labeled data on past attacks.
So instead of needing someone to manually say this is an attack, the system learns what normal looks like on its own.
Exactly. And that's why self-supervised and unsupervised learning are so promising here. They have the potential to spot new types of attacks that haven't been seen before because they're not just looking for familiar patterns from past incidents.
Right. Okay. So let's dive into that first stage of this two-stage detection system.
Yeah.
Self-supervised learning. How does this actually work in practice, according to the research?
So the basic idea of self-supervised learning, as we mentioned, is to create this training data from the normal operation of the system. The researchers in this paper talk about something called pseudo-labeling. Essentially, they use the inherent information already in the system, like the IDs of the sensors or their locations, to create temporary labels for training.
Pseudo-labeling.
Yeah.
So it's not a real label saying attack or normal, but more like a temporary tag based on where the data is coming from.
Precisely. For instance, data coming from a specific tank sensor can be temporarily labeled as belonging to that tank.
Okay.
The system then learns to recognize the typical data patterns associated with different sensors or locations, and this learning happens through what are called pretext tasks.
Pretext tasks. It sounds like a way to kind of trick the system into learning something useful as a side effect of solving a different, simpler problem.
That's a very insightful way to put it in this research. One of the key pretext tasks is contrasting sensor readings the system learns by looking at how readings from different sensors typically relate to each other, how they usually go up and down together, or in opposite ways under normal conditions.
So it's learning the normal conversation between all the different data points in the water system.
Yes, exactly. By comparing readings from various sensors, say the pressure in one pipe versus the flow rate in another,
Right.
the system builds this understanding of what normal behavior looks like. Once it has this prior knowledge from the self-supervised learning stage, it's used in stage 1 to trigger initial alarms if something seems off.
Okay, and what kind of algorithms are used in this first stage to actually sound the alarm?
The researchers looked at several quick and adaptable algorithms, KNN, SVM, Random Forest XGBoost, and BOBIS. These algorithms take the patterns learned in that self-supervised stage and use them to identify unusual activity that doesn't fit the learned normal patterns.
Quick and adaptable, meaning they can make decisions rapidly, but also adjust to changes in the system's behavior over time.
Exactly, and they also address something called concept drift. Water systems aren't static. Their behavior can change gradually due to things like changes in demand during different seasons or upgrades to the infrastructure. So the algorithms in stage 1 are designed to adapt to these slow shifts in the data patterns.
So the system is not only learning what's normal, but also trying to keep up with how normal might evolve over time.
Right.
What's the main goal of this first stage? Is it speed above all else?
Precisely, the main goal of stage 1 is to provide this near real-time initial detection, even if it's not always perfectly accurate at this stage. The idea is to quickly flag anything suspicious for a closer look. The paper mentions a detection sensitivity of around 66% using the BOSS algorithm in this initial stage.
Okay, so it might occasionally raise a false alarm, but it's designed to be fast and catch potential problems early on.
Right.
That makes sense. Let's move on to stage 2, then unsupervised learning. What role does this play in the overall detection system?
So stage 2 acts as a confirmation step for any potential attacks that were flagged in stage 1. It uses unsupervised learning to provide a more thorough and accurate assessment.
No.
The specific algorithm that the researchers focused on here is called the isolation forest, or iForest.
Isolation forest, that sounds interesting. How does it work? Is it different from just looking for things that deviate from the learned normal behavior?
Yes, it takes a different approach. Instead of building this detailed profile of what normal behavior looks like, iForest focuses on identifying anomalies by trying to isolate them.
Okay.
It uses a collection of decision trees. And the key idea is that anomalies, because they are rare and different, are easier to separate from the rest of the data with fewer steps in these trees. They tend to appear closer to the root of the trees.
So normal data points require more and more splits to be isolated within these trees, while anomalies get picked out much earlier in the process.
Exactly. It's like trying to find, one odd-colored marble in a big bag of mostly similar marbles. It's much easier to pick out the one that's completely different.
Right.
The paper reports a high accuracy of around 94% using isolation forest in this second stage.
Wow, 94% accuracy in confirming attacks. That's a big jump in confidence from that initial 66% sensitivity in stage 1.
It is.
So stage 2 is all about being highly accurate and precise, making sure those initial alarms were indeed real threats.
That's the core idea, by combining a fast but potentially less precise stage 1 with a highly accurate security. Stage 2, the system aims to give you the best of both worlds, quick detection and reliable confirmation.
So if I understand correctly, both stages are constantly looking at the data coming in from all the different parts of the water network, those tank pressure readings, pump flow rates, everything. Yeah.
Yes. Both stages analyze the same raw data from all the network devices. Stage 1 uses the patterns it learned in that self-supervised phase to quickly spot anything that looks unusual, and then Stage 2 does a more in-depth analysis using the isolation forest algorithm to confirm if those unusual patterns are actually signs of an attack.
It sounds like a really smart way to balance the need for speed and accuracy when it comes to protecting our water supply.
Right.
Now, how did the researchers actually test this system? What kind of data did they use to see how well it works?
So they put their system to the test using the dataset. This is a well-known real-world dataset that represents a water distribution system called Seatown, and it includes simulations of various cyber-physical attacks.
Simulated attacks, so not real-world breaches, but carefully designed scenarios to see if the detection system can spot them.
Correct. The dataset was created using a simulation tool and includes different kinds of attacks. The Seatown system itself is quite complex, with hundreds of pipes and junctions, 7 sensors that measure water levels, 11 pumps, 4 valves, and a reservoir.
It sounds like a pretty realistic stand-in for a real water distribution network.
It is.
And what kind of attacks were simulated in this data set?
The dataset includes 7 different types of attacks. Some involve manipulating the signals from sensors, for example, making a sensor report a low water level when it's actually high, which could trick the system into turning on pumps unnecessarily and causing a flood, or the other way around, potentially leading to a water shortage.
Right.
Other attacks target the control signals sent to the pumps changing their speed, which can also cause problems with water levels and things like that.
Can you give us a specific example of one of these simulated attacks so we can really picture what they were testing?
Sure. Attack #1, for instance, involved messing with the signal from sensor T7, which monitors the water level in one of the tanks. The fake signal would show a high level when it was actually low, making the system think there was plenty of water and potentially leading to a drought in that area. Attack #3, on the other hand, involved sending false low-level readings from sensor T1, causing pumps PU1 and PU2 to stay on, and eventually causing an overflow in tank T1.
So these are the kinds of subtle manipulations that traditional security measures might overlook because they're not obvious system failures or intrusions.
Exactly.
Now, when the researchers tested their two-stage system against this bad dull data, what kind of results did they see?
So the researchers looked at various ways to measure performance, considering different time frames for analyzing the data, and they noticed this inherent trade-off between how often they checked the data and the number of false alarms they got checking more often can lead to faster detection, but might also increase the risk of raising alarms when there's no real threat.
That makes sense. If you're constantly on high alert, you might see threats where there aren't any.
Exactly. They found that while some of the individual algorithms in stage 1, like BossXG Boost and Random Forest, didn't perform better than some existing methods in terms of overall accuracy when directly compared on the Batadal data, their ability to adapt to changing data patterns, that concept drift we talked about, is a significant advantage in the real world.
So maybe not the absolute highest accuracy in a controlled test, but potentially more reliable in a real-world system where things are always changing.
Precisely. And the isolation forest in stage 2 really stood out in terms of accuracy compared to other unsupervised methods, achieving that impressive 94%.
Right.
They also looked at how sensitive the system was, how often it correctly identified an attack when one was actually happening. Interestingly, the stage 1 algorithms sometimes outperformed iForest in this specific area, highlighting their role in providing that initial quick warning.
So stage 1 might have a few more oops, never mind moments, but it's more likely to shout fire when there's actually smoke, allowing stage 2 to come in and confirm if it's a real blaze.
That's a good way to put it. The combination of a sensitive stage 1 for near real-time alerts and a highly accurate stage 2 for confirmation seems to offer a very strong attack detection system.
Sounds like this two-stage approach could be a real step forward in protecting our vital water infrastructure, looking beyond just water systems. Do you think this kind of approach could be useful for protecting other critical infrastructure as well?
Absolutely. While the specific algorithms and data features might need to be adjusted, the basic idea of this two-stage detection system that uses self-supervised learning for early warning and unsupervised learning for accurate confirmation could be very relevant to other cyber-physical systems and smart industries. Think about things like power grids, oil and gas pipelines, transportation networks, even telecommunications infrastructure.
Wow.
All of these rely on interconnected digital and physical components and face similar kinds of threats.
It's fascinating to consider how this kind of layered security approach could improve the safety of so many essential services that we rely on every day.
It's about building resilience and having multiple lines of defense, especially when we're facing increasingly sophisticated and new kinds of attacks.
So to kind of wrap things up, what's the main takeaway from this deep dive into this research on detecting cyber-physical attacks in water systems?
I think the key insight is that this two-stage attack detection system, which cleverly uses self-supervised learning for fast initial warnings and unsupervised learning for accurate confirmation, offers a really promising way to protect our critical water infrastructure against these increasingly complex threats. It's all about striking that right balance between catching potential attacks quickly and making sure we're not overwhelmed by false alarms.
Right, and it really shows how powerful it can be to combine different kinds of machine learning techniques to tackle these unique security challenges in the cyber-physical world.
Right.
Now, as we finish up, what's one final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with, something to really think about?
As cyber-physical systems become even more woven into the fabric of our daily lives, it's crucial to consider how the ongoing advancements in machine learning will continue to shape the future of infrastructure security and resilience against threats that we might not even be aware of yet. How will these proactive detection systems fundamentally change our ability to maintain the essential services that we often take for granted?
That's a really thought-provoking question to consider. If you'd like to explore the technical details of the algorithms the data used and the full results of their testing, we encourage you to check out the research paper we've been discussing, a time series self-supervised learning approach to detection of cyber-physical attacks in water distribution systems by Mahmoud Wu and Gaber. There's a lot more information there for those of you who want to delve deeper into this fascinating area.
And beyond this specific paper, there's this whole field of research constantly evolving in cyber-physical security and using machine learning for anomaly detection. It's a rapidly changing area with significant implications for all of us.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Thank you.
We hope it's given you some valuable insights into this really important area of research and development. Until our next exploration.
See you then.